In 1983, the UK's first commercial breakfast television channel was launched, and for almost 10 years, the channel suffered numerous problems, from near constant management changes to broadcasting while most of its staff were on strike. And yet, despite all these issues, it was at one point the most profitable TV station in the world. This is the story of what I believe to be the most problematic TV channel in history. This is the story of tvam. Before getting into the history of tvam, it's important to explain the history of ITV, the network tvam was a part of, in order to properly understand the context of its creation. It's quite a long story, so I'll try to keep it brief. In 1954, a Television Act was passed that allowed the creation of the UK's first commercial television network, which would be known as Independent Television, or ITV for short. The purpose of ITV was to break the monopoly that the BBC had on television up to that point. Unlike the BBC, which was one company broadcasting across the entire country, ITV would be made up of around 15 regional franchises, all of which were to be run by different companies. The first 6 franchises launched in 1955 and 1956, with the rest launching by 1962. The franchises were awarded to their companies by the Independent Television Authority, which was set up to regulate the new network. In 1963, 1967, 1974, 1980 and 1991, the ITA and their successor the Independent Broadcasting Authority, or IBA, carried out a review of all the ITV franchises. For the first 3 franchise rounds, all that really came of them was just that some franchisees were replaced. However, the 1980 franchise round would be quite different. In addition to some of the franchises being replaced, several substantial changes were made to the ITV network. These include splitting the South region into South and South East, and splitting the Midlands region into East and West Midlands. By far the biggest change, however, was the creation of an entirely new franchise. At this point in time, the concept of breakfast television was still fairly new in the UK. ITV franchisees Yorkshire Television and Tyne-Tees Television had previously launched breakfast television programmes in 1977, but both only lasted around 9 weeks. However, they were popular enough to convince the IBA that a national breakfast television service could work, and so the IBA created a new ITV franchise for breakfast television. Unlike the other ITV franchises, this one would operate across the entire country, rather than just a specific region. 8 companies applied for this new franchise, and on December 28, 1980, the results of this franchise round were announced. The breakfast television franchise was awarded to a company known as tvam. tvam was founded by a man named Peter Jay. Jay had previously worked for another ITV franchise, London Weekend Television, as a presenter for a political programme called Weekend World in the early 70s. Around the same time, he was also an editor for The Times, and had co-authored several articles criticising TV journalism. These criticisms would form the basis of Jay's vision for tvam. This vision, referred to as the Mission to Explain, described a news-focused station that presented stories in their full context, with those stories being thoroughly analysed. It sounded like a good idea in concept, but as we'll see, this would end up being far from the case. But clearly, the IBA were impressed by this, and tvam were awarded the franchise. In preparation for their launch, a former car showroom in Camden Town, London, was converted into their main studios. Known as the Breakfast Television Centre, the building notably had plastic egg cups installed on the roof. The station was due to launch in 1982 and would air from 6 AM to 9:25 AM. Everything seemed to be coming together nicely. Unfortunately, tvam would run into its first major problem before it had even launched. Despite originally being set to launch in 1982, tvam's launch date was soon delayed to June of 1983. This was so the station's launch wouldn't interfere with the launch of the UK's 4th main channel, Channel 4. This wasn't much of a problem for tvam, however, as it gave them more time to prepare for their launch. Little did they know that this delay would inevitably create their main rival. As it turned out, the IBA weren't the only ones interested in breakfast television. The BBC had also seen how much public interest there was in the concept, and began making plans for their own breakfast programme. Once TVAM's launch was delayed, the BBC saw an opportunity to launch their programme first, and so rushed the programme, known as Breakfast Time, to air, launching on January 17th, 1983. Of course, this was bad news for TVAM, as they still had another 5 months until they began airing. Not wanting Breakfast Time to steal all their viewers away, TVAM decided to bring their launch forward to February 1st, 1983, around 4 months before they were originally supposed to. This ended up causing numerous problems for TVAM pretty much immediately. First, it meant that the station would launch before the IBA could negotiate with the Actors Union Equity about rates for advertising. This led to members of Equity boycotting the station, which meant that no advertisements featuring paid actors would be aired on TVAM. Secondly, British Telecom, who were in charge of switching TVAM's signal to the regional franchises, were working on a way to automatically switch the signal. However, they had planned to implement this system by TVAM's original launch date. With the launch date brought forward so much, they would instead have to manually switch over the signal. Because of this, TVAM would instead close at 9:15 AM instead of 9:25, in order to give BT enough time to switch the signal. But despite these issues, TVAM would officially begin airing at 6 AM on February 1st, 1983.
To TVAM, new studios, a new news service and a new national network.
TVAM's launch began with an introduction from their 5 main presenters, dubbed the Famous Five. These presenters consisted of Michael Parkinson, David Frost, Angela Rippon, Anna Ford and Robert Key, all of whom were journalists and news presenters. Not only were they presenters, they were also shareholders in the channel, having joined TVAM after leaving or being fired from their jobs at the BBC and ITN. Before TVAM had launched, an administration error had caused each of the presenters to be given the wrong contracts, and when this problem was sorted out, not only did Rippon discover she was being paid only $60,000 a year compared to Ford's £75,000 a year, but both Rippon and Ford discovered that Frost and Parkinson were being paid £250,000 a year, which must have been pretty awkward. But as for the channel itself, it was initially split into 2 programs, the first being Daybreak, an hour-long news program hosted by Key and Rippon, followed by Good Morning Britain, the main program hosted by Frost and Ford, which aired for the remainder of TVAM's broadcasting time. Throughout the first day and for a while after, there were very few advertisements. This, of course, stemmed from the dispute between the IBA and Equity. Within a month, TVAM's ratings had dropped to just under 300,000 viewers. By comparison, the BBC's Breakfast Time consistently had a viewership of over 1 million. Something must have gone terribly wrong. And as it turned out, the main problem lied with Peter J's mission to explain. The focus on hard news and serious discussions just didn't resonate with people at that time of day. Especially when Breakfast Time, which TVAM thought would take the same approach, was much more light-hearted and accessible. Thankfully for TVAM, on weekends the ratings were considerably higher, with the Saturday editions drawing in around 1.5 million viewers. However, this was almost entirely down to the fact that Breakfast Time didn't air on weekends, and even still, most of the week had abysmal ratings, so changes were clearly necessary. The first changes came on the 28th of February, with Daybreak being reduced to 30 minutes, which in turn led to Good Morning Britain being moved 30 minutes earlier, and some of the presenters were moved around. After the first week, this new format had increased ratings by 200,000, and after the second week, ratings had reached a peak of 500,000. It seemed that everything was finally going well. Until the 18th of March, when Peter J was ousted as CEO and left TVAM entirely. His replacement was Jonathan Aitken, a Conservative MP. This came after investors had demanded changes in leadership due to the incredibly low ratings. That same day, Angela Rippon and Anna Ford announced their support for Jay and called the replacement of him an act of treachery, unaware he had already left the company. They weren't the only ones unhappy with the new leadership, however, as many at the IBA disliked the idea of an MP being the CEO of TVAM, believing it would affect the station's political freedom. Ultimately, the IBA would only allow Aitken to run TVAM for a limited time, under strict supervision. Under Aitken's leadership, several changes were to be made to TVAM. Firstly, the number of advert breaks would be cut, in hopes that it would increase ratings after viewership had once again decreased. Secondly, and much more importantly, on the 1st of April, Roland Rat made his first appearance. He was created in an effort to increase the number of younger viewers over the Easter holidays. And it worked. In fact, over the summer of 1983, he helped to increase TVAM's ratings to over 1.5 million. But of course, this was still a few months away. On the 4th of April, TVAM hired Greg Dyke, who had previously worked at London Weekend Television, as the director of programs. He would then start working on a completely new format for TVAM, which would launch the following month. In the meantime, on the 14th of April, Jonathan Aitken resigned and was replaced by his cousin Timothy. 5 days later, both Rippon and Ford were fired, with no reason given, though it's believed to be due to their public support for Peter J, as well as to cut costs. At the same time, Michael Parkinson was made a company director, and staff that disagreed with this change were threatened with the loss of their jobs. Rippon and Ford were understandably outraged by their firing and planned to sue TVAM, although the case was later dropped. However, Ford did get her revenge on Jonathan Aitken, when the two encountered each other at a party later on, and Ford threw her glass of wine in his face. But finally, on the 23rd of May, the new look TVAM was launched. This new look brought several changes. First of all, Daybreak was axed entirely, with Good Morning Britain now filling TVAM's entire airtime. In addition to this, several new features were introduced, with features dedicated to exercise, cooking, fishing, and bingo. By the end of the first week of this new format, ratings, which had dropped to around 100,000, had doubled to 200,000. However, by this point the company was in dire financial straits. The London Electricity Board repeatedly threatened to cut off power to their studios, presenters weren't paid on several occasions, and the local newsagents stopped supplying them with newspapers due to a lack of payment. Because of this, TVAM decided to spend the summer on the road, using one of their broadcasting vans to drive to seaside resorts across the UK. As mentioned previously, ratings increased dramatically over the summer to over 1.5 million. Despite this, however, the company was still not doing well financially, and throughout October, it was speculated that TVAM were close to collapsing altogether. Thankfully, in November, new shareholders such as Ladbrokes and the owners of the Daily Express injected £4.5 million into the company to keep it afloat. In early 1984, Australian business tycoon Kerry Packer would purchase a substantial stake in TVAM, and would soon appoint a new CEO. This change in leadership would end up changing TVAM forever, with both good and bad results. Packer's choice of CEO was Bruce Gyngell. Gyngell was a fairly well-known figure in the TV industry, having helped to create Australia's first commercial station, the 9 Network, and was actually the first person to ever be seen on Australian television.
Good evening and welcome to television.
He had also previously been the deputy chairman of former ITV franchisee ATV, so he seemed like a good pick. Gyngell's vision for TVAM was to continue the same approach that Greg Dyke had already established, while also cutting costs wherever possible. Dyke himself would leave the company a few weeks after Gyngell was appointed, having accepted a new position at TVS, another ITV franchisee. With that, the cost-cutting began. While this did result in TVAM's profits increasing, it also led to an increasingly noticeable decline in quality. The lack of quality became most apparent on the 12th of October 1984. At 2:54 AM that day, the Irish Republican Army bombed the Grand Hotel in Brighton, in an attempt to assassinate members of the British government, particularly Margaret Thatcher, the UK's Prime Minister at the time, who were all attending a conference at the hotel. While Thatcher herself survived the bombing, 5 people were killed, with around 30 more injured. The BBC and ITN were able to provide immediate coverage of the attack. However, TVAM was not. The previous night, TVAM's news team had reported on the conference before going back to London to report on a train crash in Wembley. Because of this, TVAM's news team was not able to record any footage at the scene of the bombing. Instead, TVAM's coverage of the attack consisted of a picture of reporter John Stapleton, who described the attack over the phone. Trade union agreements meant that TVS were not able to cover for them, and previous conflicts with ITN meant that the latter simply refused to share their footage. This whole situation caused the IBA to threaten to revoke TVAM's license if their news coverage wasn't improved. Of course, this would mean spending more money, which went against the company's new cost-cutting measures, and so Gyngell would need to find a way to invest in their news department while still keeping costs low. And his solution was less than popular. Gyngell believed that by investing in the most up-to-date broadcasting technology, the station would be able to produce high-quality content while also requiring less staff. For example, news gathering crews would no longer need a separate lighting technician, and technical staff would no longer be needed at all. This idea brought Gyngell into conflict with the trade unions, but also gained in support from Margaret Thatcher and her government. By the end of 1986, TVAM had finally overtaken Breakfast Time to become the UK's most popular breakfast television service. However, the following year, things would once again go wrong. In October 1987, a violent storm hit the UK and cut the power to TVAM's studios. This meant that an emergency service had to be broadcast from Thames Television Studios on Euston Road, with news reports being provided by ICN, TSW and TVS, as well as TVAM's own news crew. Despite this setback, the station continued to thrive. That was until the following month, when, after a dispute over their Caring Christmas campaign, TVAM's technical staff decided to go on strike. While the strike was only supposed to last 24 hours, it would end up lasting for several months, as TVAM's management locked out the strikers. Despite all this, the station continued to air, although the only things that were able to air were imports of old American shows. However, on the 7th of December, a reduced normal service resumed, with the studio's receptionists manning the cameras and Bruce Gyngell himself directing the programs. Despite the incredibly low-budget production, TVAM's ratings continued to increase. Unfortunately, despite further discussions with the unions, on the 16th of February 1988, all the striking technicians were fired, with many only finding out about their firing from an announcement made on ITV's News at 10. Because of the heavily reduced staff, by the dawn of the 1990s, TVAM had become the most profitable TV station in the entire world. Surely nothing could stop them now, right? In 1990, major changes would happen to the ITV network. The Broadcasting Act 1990 was passed, which aimed to deregulate ITV, which had previously been described by Margaret Thatcher as the last bastion of restrictive practices. This act would cause the abolition of the IBA, with it being replaced by the Independent Television Commission, or ITC. It would also drastically change how ITV franchises would be awarded. Previously, each company that applied for the franchise would be assessed mainly on how well the IBA believed they could run said franchise. Now, the process was reduced to simply a blind auction. Whichever company bid the most money won the franchise, the only exception being if the amount was considered too high, as the money companies bid would be an annual fee. Seeing as TVAM was the most profitable TV station on the planet at this point, that seems like it wouldn't be much of an issue, right? Unfortunately for TVAM, Bruce Gyngell decided to apply the same principles he had applied to the station itself to their bid, as in, spend as little money as possible. And so, in May 1991, TVAM bid a relatively small $14.3 million, which wasn't the lowest of all the ITV franchise bids, but certainly wasn't as high as it could be. Still, TVAM had an advantage, the fact that Margaret Thatcher was a huge fan of them. Surely, as the person responsible for the Broadcasting Act, she wouldn't allow TVAM to disappear. As it turned out,
ITV Breakfast Time, run at present, of course, by TVAM, they have lost their contract.
That's exactly what would happen. Another consortium, Sunrise Television, would bid £36.4 million, almost double TVAM's bid, and so the contract was awarded to Sunrise, with TVAM set to close on the 31st of December 1992. Thatcher would famously send a letter to Gyngell, personally apologising for being responsible for TVAM losing its licence. Throughout 1992, the effects of the loss were becoming more and more visible on the screen. The biggest change being that TVAM's news department was shut down altogether, with the news instead being provided by Sky News. Overall, many cutbacks were to be made to the station, as if they'd just given up. Finally, TVAM would air for the final time on the 31st of December, closing with a black and white photo of the station's presenters and crew members. TVAM was officially dead. The following day, TVAM's replacement, now renamed to GMTV, would begin airing. Like TVAM, it suffered from incredibly low ratings initially, but was soon able to turn things around. Ironically, GMTV were actually able to convince the ITC to reduce their annual fee to an amount even lower than TVAM's bid. GMTV would continue airing until 2010, when it was replaced by Daybreak, which was replaced by Good Morning Britain in 2014, which still airs to this day. As for TVAM Studios, they were sold to MTV in 1993, and are now owned by Paramount Global. Even after major refurbishments to the building, the TVAM egg cups still remain on the studio's roof, as a reminder of the iconic TV station that once occupied it.